Before we jump into my presentation, the nuts and bolts of my presentation, it's worth reflecting on the world of 1813 compared to the world of 2020, current events aside. In the world of 1813, an American's material conditions of existence were not all that terribly different from the material conditions of existence for someone living in Europe in 1513 or 1313 for that matter. Consider the world of energy. Most energy in 1813 was provided by animal power or human muscle power, or by burning wood or candles or other forms of combustibles. Communications could only travel as fast as a person or a person on horseback could convey that information. Transportation, same thing. Goods or people could only travel as fast as the fastest horse. Fast forward to the world of 1913 or even 2013, and the material conditions of an ordinary American look very different. So it's worth reflecting on the past 200 plus years of history and what exactly has changed, but it's just as important to reflect on how we are to make sense of these sweeping changes in the material conditions of human existence. And that really, the latter point, how we can think about the ways in which technology and society have interacted over the past 2 centuries really is the heart of my talk. So there are 2 major theories that relate the history of technology, or rather the story of technological innovation, to the story of human society. And these 2 theories, and there are variants, so we're going to take a 30,000-foot view, are called technological determinism and social construction. And we'll take these one at a time. Technological determinism, I think, is best summed up by the 1933 Chicago World's Fair Century of Progress. And on the left-hand side, you see the entrance to one of the fair buildings, and there's a tall, very big robot pushing a reluctant man and woman into the future. And the poster on the right really represents the theme of that World's Fair, which was a century of progress since the founding of the city of Chicago. And here you see allegorical representations of all kinds of scientific and engineering progress. So even in the depths of the Great Depression, we still regarded technological progress as essential to the American experience. Above the building featuring this giant robot pushing a reluctant man and woman into the future, there was a legend. This is the Hall of Industry. And the legend read, "Science finds, industry applies, man conforms." This is one of the clearest, most succinct, and starkest enunciations of the theory of technological determinism. Basically, that humanity has little or no control over the processes of scientific discovery, technological innovation, and the social conformity, the way that society and individuals have to conform to technological progress. So technological determinism basically holds that technological innovation happens first in the absence of any other social environment or attributes. And then technological innovation then causes social change. So it's a one-way relationship, really. Technological innovation happens, and then society changes in response to new technologies. Related to that is the idea that technology evolves autonomously. So the evolution of technology really is not subject to much human intervention. It's just something that happens. Obviously, people and technologists and engineers are part of the process, but by and large, once a technology is innovated and out into the world, it's not subject to very much human control. 2 examples of that are Moore's Law, which semiconductor pioneer Gordon Moore first formulated in 1965. And what Moore discovered, or posited rather is a better way to put it, is that the performance of electronics, especially integrated circuits, doubles every 18 months. So in other words, think about this in the realm of consumer electronics. For those of you who have laptop computers or tablets or smartphones, think about how often you replace your consumer electronic devices. You probably replace them roughly every 18 months to 2 years to 3 years. And that's really an embodiment of Moore's Law, that as the electronics industry improves what it does, the performance of consumer electronics doubles within a given time frame, making more powerful devices available to consumers. Another example here is the nuclear arms race during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other. That process seemed to not be subject to much control by policymakers or peace advocates. So during the Cold War, we seem to be held captive to this inevitable logic of the nuclear arms race. So those are just two examples. A third aspect of technological determinism is that the social effects of technological innovations are basically inevitable. And we can only really view that in hindsight after some years have passed. But when we look back, we say, oh, okay, now that people have smartphones, things like taking videos of civilian police interactions will become more common. That's something that we could have perhaps forecasted 15 years ago or so when the first cell phones entered the market, or the first phones with video cameras. And there's a bit of a cultural lag sometimes. Part of it has to do with how quickly a technology is adopted into the marketplace. So technologies like the cell phone, for example, when they first came out in the 1990s, were mainly devices that were owned by the wealthy or people who needed to be in touch with their business partners. And today, pretty much everybody has a cell phone. So part of this cultural lag really is a function of market penetration. But it's also a function of people coming up with new uses, new ideas how to use particular technologies that are already out there. Two other corollaries to this theory of technological determinism. It's an optimistic theory. So the the social effects are usually for the good, and that technology usually means progress in that things get better for most people most of the time in most places. So let's return to that motto above the Hall of Industry at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. The first phrase, science finds, what that really means is, or what that encapsulates, is that once the basic science behind a technology is understood, it's inevitable that a technology exploiting this particular scientific discovery will arise. In other words, once something becomes possible, it's then inevitable. The second part of that phrase, industry applies, describes the relationship between scientific discovery and technological innovation. Basically, what this means is that once the technology evolves and someone innovates something based on a body of scientific knowledge, that'll be embodied in some sort of product or service that will make its way into the world and that will be largely autonomous without human intervention. And the third part of this, man conforms, really states that technology drives history, that society and individual behavior, once the technology is out into the world, that people and institutions adapt themselves to this particular new technology. Let's take these by turn. Science finds. In other words, when something is possible scientifically, then a technology embodying that set of discoveries will be inevitable. Or in other words, a more common phrasing would be, what can be done will be done. And history bears out this theory to a certain extent. Simultaneous invention is fairly common in the history of technology. My own research is on the history of the telegraph, and everyone learns in school that Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, unless you happen to be a school child living in Great Britain, in which case you learn that Wheatstone and Cooke invented the telegraph. Or if you happen to be a school child in Germany, in which case you will learn that Steinheil invented the telegraph. So at the time that Samuel Morse came out with his telegraph system, there were about 65 different versions of a telegraph that used the transmission of electricity to transmit a message almost simultaneously through any length of wire that was desired. Another famous case is the telephone in the 1870s. Again, we are taught in school that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. That's true. However, another inventor named Elisha Gray filed a patent caveat, a preliminary version of a patent, the same day as Alexander Graham Bell filed his patent in 1876, just a few hours later. And the legal controversy over who invented the telephone would last for about 15 years afterward. Thomas Edison also has a claim to having invented a telephone, a version of the telephone as well. The automobile is another great example of this. At the same time that Benz in Germany was inventing the automobile or strapping an internal combustion engine onto a carriage, there are many other people working on similar ideas, or the identical idea just developed in slightly different ways. So there are several Europeans and Americans who are working on a self-propelled vehicle using the internal combustion gasoline engine at the same time that this work was going on in Germany. Yes?
We have an audience question.
Yes.
Karen asks, regarding technology and human control, is there such a thing as planned obsolescence, by which corporations can roll out newer models in a deliberate marketing plan?
That is an excellent question. And that bears on the second theory we'll talk about, which is social construction. And again, going back to the example of Moore's law and the progress in consumer electronics, the answer is clearly yes, that the automobile industry in the United States, General Motors in particular, pioneered the concept of planned obsolescence, that a person who owns a Chevrolet might want to graduate to a Buick within 5 years, and a Buick driver might want to graduate to a Cadillac within 5 years. And certainly in the realm of consumer electronics, we do see that sometimes when you get a software update to your smartphone, all of a sudden your battery life drops. I'm not saying there's some sort of sinister cabal among Apple and Android and Google and the companies that make these devices, but there is the expectation built in that these devices do not have to last forever, because people will naturally want to upgrade to the newer form of a particular technology. So yes, planned obsolescence counters this theory that technologies are autonomous and self-acting. When industry decides that it's time for a new product release, that doesn't happen by accident. That is human intervention into this, the way that technology and society work together. So that's an excellent question. So one of my favorite examples of the simultaneous development of particular technologies that embody scientific discoveries. Again, this is sort of evidence for the theory of technological determinism. What you see here, if I were giving this talk in Albany, New York, everyone would know who this is and where this is. And since I assume that very few of you are in the Albany, New York area, I will explain what we're looking at. This is a statue of Joseph Henry. Those of you who are on your computers, which is the entire audience, feel free to Google Joseph Henry. Joseph Henry was America's second internationally renowned scientist. The first, of course, was Benjamin Franklin. Joseph Henry was a physicist and is a high school teacher at the Albany Academy, which is the building behind the statue of Henry. And the building still stands. It's used by the Albany Board of Education. The Albany Academy was a private elite boys' high school in the early Republic. As a high school science teacher, or natural philosophy as the phrasing went then, Joseph Henry invented the electromagnet, or at least a variation of it that could be put to use. And Henry invented two versions of the magnet. One was a huge magnet that could suspend several hundred pounds of iron through an electric circuit. Another was a smaller type of magnet, about finger length apart, that could be actuated at great distances from a battery, through miles of wire. When Henry developed that particular version of his electromagnet, he realized and demonstrated to his classes at Albany, and then later he became a professor at Princeton, and then the first head of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. When he was demonstrating this around 1830 to his Albany Academy students, he would ring a bell through several miles of wire. And he realized that if I could ring a bell through several miles of wire, it's possible in principle to transmit information through several miles of wire almost instantaneously. But he was a scientist, and he often said that scientists, and I'm obviously paraphrasing and not using 1830s language, He often said that scientists do not patent their discoveries, that their discoveries are free and open to anyone who can make use of them. Ben Franklin said the same thing about his lightning rod and his stove. So when Samuel Morse came up with a design for his telegraph in the 1830s, bit of a tangent, again, Google Samuel F.B. Morse. Morse was a portrait painter who had no idea how electricity worked. I'm not going to belabor you with the details, but suffice it to say that Morse, just like Alexander Graham Bell a couple generations later, didn't know enough to know that what he was proposing to do, that is sending messages through miles of electric wire through a code, that this in fact was impossible. Same thing with Alexander Graham Bell. Any reputable electrical scientist in the 1870s would have told Bell, you can't transmit the human voice through electricity, that's ridiculous. So Morse didn't know what he didn't know. But he had the idea and went about implementing it. He wanted Congress to buy his patent and put his telegraph under control of the US Post Office, which was the premier way of conveying messages in the 1830s and 1840s. And Congress was reluctant to spend the $30,000, later $100,000 to buy his patent. So Morse asked Joseph Henry to evaluate his telegraph. And Henry said, yeah, you've got a pretty good design here, but there are other designs out there. So in this letter Henry wrote to support Morse's application to the US Congress to buy his patent, Henry basically said, science is now fully ripe for an invention like this. I've evaluated multiple designs. Morse's is the simplest and most effective, and I think of all the other designs out there that use my discoveries, Morse's is the most suited for a national communication system. So Henry never backed away from claiming that he had developed the science behind the telegraph, but he never claimed the engineering or the technology behind the device itself. Another strand of this theory of technological determinism is autonomous technology, and here I'm showing a friendly version and a not so friendly version. On the left-hand side, this is from the 1940s. It's a mock-up of a robot that would do your household chores for you. You see the robot wearing a bow tie and using a vacuum cleaner. There's a new television set off to the left of the robot. A very kind of benign, useful, who wouldn't want a robot that would clean your house for you? I guess, was it in the Jetsons, Rosie was it Rosie? Yeah, so who wouldn't want Rosie cleaning your house? On the right-hand side, you may have already guessed that this is the Terminator from the 1980s thriller of the same name, The Terminator, which is not at all a friendly android. This is an android that is out to kill humanity. But what ties these two together is the idea that these technologies are autonomous, that you do not have to give them instructions, that they will act on their own. Whether or not they're self-aware or conscious is another debate. But these are autonomous, self-acting technologies that are not subject to much human intervention, for better or for worse.
We have another audience question.
Awesome.
Steve says, please comment on manufacturing scale as a tech driver. When toilets or electric cars got mass produced, they get cheap. If we all demanded cell phones in 1985, is there magic that would have delivered?
That's an interesting question. Let's take the cell phone in 1985 issue. I'm reminded of the movie Wall Street, which is when I first saw a cell phone. It was one of those Motorola bricks. It looked like a World War II walkie-talkie. Electronics had not yet progressed to the point where you could scale that down into this, even without connection to the internet and the fact that this is a pocket computer. It would not have been possible in 1985, for all sorts of reasons, to scale that Motorola brick down to a telephone this size, and then the entire communications network that connects this to other people's this. So in 1985, it was not possible, no matter how many people demanded cheap cell phones, to create that technology. It required advances in electronics, in signal processing, in the infrastructure required to build basically a parallel telephone network in order to have ubiquitous and affordable mobile telephony. Getting to the point where we all have pocket computers, I'm reminded of a cartoon I saw several years ago, and I believe it was in the New Yorker, but I don't remember clearly. And the question was, maybe it was a Reddit thread, sorry about that. If someone from the 1950s appeared today, what would be the one thing you would have trouble explaining to that person? And one of the answers was, I have a device in my pocket that is capable of accessing all of human information and knowledge and of communicating with anyone else on the planet. I use it to look at pictures of cats and get into arguments with strangers. That bears onto the social construction issue, which is the people who developed mobile phones, AT&T in the 1970s and 1980s, could not imagine the uses to which we put this device. And the uses are sometimes perverse and unintentional. So that's an excellent question. This idea of autonomous technology, technologies that have agency, that are self-acting, has a long history that goes back to really around the time when this mill was built in 1813, a little later. We'll start with Ralph Waldo Emerson. There are two questions here that historians love to discuss, environmental historians as well as historians of technology. What exactly is agency? What does it mean to be an agent? And who or what are agents? So is agency self-awareness, self-consciousness, or is agency the ability to act without necessarily being conscious or self-aware? And then related to that, who or what are agents? So if you talk to an environmental historian, for example, an environmental historian will argue that the boll weevil has agency. So how the boll weevil has affected the cotton crop and helped contribute to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, that even the boll weevil is not an intelligent, autonomous, self-aware thing. It still acted in a purposeful way that created significant change in human history. So by that definition, technologies are agents. And Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 1840s was perhaps the first in US culture anyway to identify this. And in one of his essays, he remarked that things are in the saddle and ride mankind. At the same time, Henry David Thoreau in Walden had a really interesting thought experiment. He said, okay, people tell me that you can get from Walden to Boston on the train very quickly, in an hour and a half or 2 hours at the time. However, is that really true? Let's think about this a little further. Yes, I could ride the train and it would take me 2 hours to get to Boston, but how much does the ticket cost? And then how much would it take me to earn the price of the ticket? And if I did, day labor on someone's farm, it would take me this amount of time to earn the money to buy the ticket to ride the railroad. I can walk to Boston faster than that. So this is Thoreau in kind of his iconoclastic way, playing with this idea that here's this new convenience. And Thoreau basically saying, this isn't as convenient as you think if you have to earn the money to buy your passage on the railroad. In fact, it's easier just to walk. Kevin Kelly, who was an editor of Wired magazine for many years, in a book called What Technology Wants, which came out around 10 years ago, uses the phrase Bossy Technologies to describe how we interact with a lot of latter-day websites and electronics, consumer electronics, that this device here, and you all have probably experienced this device here wants to be used in a particular way. You can't use this device in ways that it's not intended to. In many ways, that's because its capabilities are limited, but in other ways, it's because, and I'm going to step out of the technological determinism role here, this has been constructed to behave in a certain way. So in many ways, our technologies are bossy, and they determine human behavior in ways that sometimes we're aware of, like Thoreau was, and sometimes we're unaware of. A famous scene, and I'm not going to jump out of the presentation to link to it, and you've all probably have seen this scene from 2001: A Space Odyssey, where one of the astronauts is trapped outside the spacecraft, wants to get back into the spacecraft, and Hal, the supercomputer on board the spacecraft, will not let him back into the craft. This is an example, perhaps going back to the Terminator, a less sinister version of the Terminator, but certainly a piece of self-aware technology, computing technology, that refuses to obey human orders, human desires. And I encourage you to watch that at your leisure. Now, the second major theory to help us understand the relationship between technological innovation and social organization is called social construction. And it's at the other end of the spectrum from technological determinism. Technological determinism, basically, once a scientific discovery has been discovered, it's inevitable that a technology exploiting that body of science will arise. Once that technology is out there, it will penetrate into the marketplace and people will shape their behaviors around this new device. Social construction turns this around and says, society really shapes technology instead. That, especially through market demand, and the question earlier about the cell phone in 1985, whether that would have been possible, is appropriate to this discussion. Basically, social constructivists hold that social needs and desires, especially consumer needs and desires in a capitalist market economy, will determine what technologies survive in the marketplace. So lots of things are possible, but very few things are actually developed and used widely in society. Social constructivists also talk about what they call relevant user groups, and we'll talk more about this when we look at the early bicycle. Basically, a relevant user group is someone who uses a particular technology in a particular way to achieve particular desired ends. And those technologies or those uses can create very different manifestations of what we would consider a technology like the bicycle. And again, more on that in a second. The evidence that social constructivists use is pretty wide-ranging, but I'm going to use two. The first is the picture phone developed by AT&T in the 1960s and the early bicycle. We could also talk about the early personal computer in that you had two versions. You had the Macintosh with a graphical user interface and a mouse, and you had the IBM PC with the MS-DOS shell, and I'm dating myself here. Those of you who have used the MS-DOS shell compared to a modern browser-oriented, mouse-oriented computer, understand that there are two different psychologies that were available, two different ways that the computer interacted with your mind in the 1980s. Something that was more intuitive and user-driven, and something that was more about understanding how the machine itself operated. And I don't long for the days of the MS-DOS shell, and I doubt that very few of us do. So social constructivists basically say, and rightly so to a large extent, that technology is part of culture. That one thing, there are several things that have defined humanity throughout our existence as an intelligent species. Making and using tools, and that's technology. Language, that is the ability to communicate through sound and gesture, and the ability to understand the passage of time. Those three attributes are fundamental to what it means to be human. And technology is one of those fundamental attributes. So a social constructivist would say technology is part of human culture. It's not something autonomous that's outside of individual human experience. It's part of who we are as humans and as social creatures. So let's talk about some of these examples. Again, I encourage you to jump out of the presentation and view another clip from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is one of the early characters, is on a space station. 2001, we'd have space stations. Sorry, I like futures that were supposed to have happened but never did. We did not get the world of 2001: A Space Odyssey. As a tangent, and I apologize for this, but not all that much. A few years ago, MIT Technology Review ran an issue with a very angry Buzz Aldrin on the cover, and the caption read, "You promised me Mars colonies, instead I got Facebook." So this sort of represents, in a flippant way, but I think a telling way, that technology does not evolve according to its own logic necessarily. If we thought about 1970 or 1968 and the space program, we would take it as a given that in the year 2001, we would have orbital hotels and moon bases, and that we would not have a pocket computer. That turned out not to be the case. So in any event, in 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the characters is on an orbital hotel and calls home to his family and talks to his young daughter using a picture phone. AT&T had rolled out the picture phone for the 1964 World's Fair, New York City World's Fair. And they thought this would be a big thing because not only was it possible to transmit the human voice, but you could actually see the person you were talking to. It turned out it was a flop. It didn't get widely adopted because it was expensive. In the 1960s, it cost $150 a month for one of these video phones, for the service rather, per terminal. And then there were costs for using that terminal, which were quite high. So AT&T thought, well, maybe business customers would want to use these, and these picture phones would take the place of face-to-face meetings and save on transportation costs. Instead of flying from Los Angeles to New York for a business meeting, why not simply call my counterpart in New York and have a face-to-face phone chat? It turns out that people didn't like being seen on the phone. And more importantly, people didn't like being stationary on the phone. And think about this when we were using landlines. Those of you who had landlines with long cords may have run around the apartment or the house doing things. You might have sat down for a few minutes. You might have gone to the kitchen to get a drink of water. You didn't want to be tied to something at your desk. However, flash forward 50 years later, everyone, and of course we're all living in a world of Zoom, everyone has video conferencing freely available, free of charge, on your phones. And this is a widely used accessory on people's smartphones. So it turns out this video phones did have a market. It's just that when AT&T developed the technology, that market was premature. Yes?
Another audience question, and it's regarding society-shaping technology. Will you be commenting on the role DARPA has played in widely used devices? I understand DARPA's work is largely responsible for what ultimately became the household microwave oven.
Yeah, this threatens to turn into a longer discussion of the pivotal role of the federal government in fostering technological innovation. I alluded to the telegraph. Congress provided Samuel Morse $30,000 to build his first line between Washington and Baltimore. The post office has a long and somewhat unappreciated history in driving technological innovation. Fast railway mail service in the 1870s, the infant airline industry in the 1920s in airmail. DARPA, let's take that and stick to DARPA. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, I believe is what it stands for, did a number of things. One is the internet. Again, think of the pivotal role of the federal government in communications innovation since the days of the stagecoach. First the postal system, then after about 1960, DARPA. DARPA basically created the internet. The internet in the 1960s and early 70s was a system that connected research university mainframe computers together and was intended to the routing protocol was intended to be a communications system robust and redundant enough to survive a nuclear first strike. I'll leave it at that, but suffice it to say that ARPANET, as the internet was first known, connected research organizations like universities and think tanks, connected their mainframe computers to more efficiently share scarce computing time. Around 1990, the Defense Department separated a military form of the internet called MILNET and then slowly migrated ARPANET into the civilian world, the commercial world. And by the mid-90s, 1994, I believe, is when it was first released as a commercial thing, where companies could begin selling products. Prodigy and AOL and CompuServe began marketing essentially bulletin board services. So there's a pivotal role that the federal government played in driving technological innovation, especially in communications and transportation. ARPANET, or the internet, is part of that. The Defense Department and the Air Force in particular also drove innovation in microelectronics, in integrated circuits and other similar technologies to provide reliable electronics for use in aerospace applications. So the federal government has driven, since World War II especially, But since the 1790s, since the 1792 passage of the Post Office Act, which jump-started the stagecoach industry, the federal government has played a pivotal role in driving technological innovation, especially in communications and information and transportation. I hope that answers that person's question. Let's take the bicycle as another example. Here you see a bicycle race in Great Britain at the Crystal Palace in London in 1889. And as you see, these bicycles, these high-wheelers, the penny farthings as they were called, think about who's riding them. These are young men, athletic men. They're they're conducting a race around a track. They're not padded or helmeted in any way. This looks very unsafe to me. There is no way, I'm afraid of heights, even that height. And there's no way I would ride one of these to get to work. So this is one form of the bicycle. This is meant for sport, for athletic young men to engage in high-risk athletic competitions. Here's the feminist Frances Willard in 1895 learning how to ride a bicycle. This bicycle that Willard is riding is not this bicycle. Frances Willard probably would never, ever, ever have gotten onto the penny farthing. So the question here is, are these the same things? Can we call both of these the same technology, the same product? And a social constructivist would say, no. This is one technology, one product. This is another product. Superficially, they're the same. They have two wheels and a driving chain and pedals and a handlebar, but they're very different applications. They're used for different things. The former is used for athletic competitions, which might result in broken bones or concussions. This is used for transportation that even a middle-aged feminist could learn how to ride, wearing a skirt. And here's an example of how the bicycle was used during the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement in the early 20th century. Here you see a sign saying law-abiding women suffragists and several women with a bicycle. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton famously remarked, sometime around the turn of the 20th century, woman is riding to suffrage on a bicycle. So this harnessing of a form of transportation for political goals marks the safety bicycle, as it was called, as a very different kind of technology from the penny farthing bicycle. So social constructivists would say these are two different devices. These are two different technologies. So social constructivists would also say that you have two competing forms of bicycle. You have the penny farthing, the high wheeler. You have the safety bicycle that's more suited for everyday mundane transportation. What happens? What a social constructivist would say is that the technology enters a phase called closure. That is, the bicycle takes on its final form. We recognize this as a bicycle. Looks like it has pneumatic tires. It's a modern bicycle in every way except superficial ways. We would not recognize this as a modern bicycle. This is an evolutionary dead end. So social constructivists would say that due to a process of closure, that is, more people preferred to buy the safety bicycle than the penny farthing high wheeler. The market spoke, or consumer preference and political agendas spoke, and determined that this form of bicycle would enter a phase of closure in which only one form of the bicycle would survive past the turn of the 20th century. Do machines make history? Yeah, I think it's inescapable to say that technology does shape history, that technology does make history. And I'm standing in a museum devoted to the history of technology, and I can allude to dozens of examples of machines and processes and ways of organizing work that have created history. The fact that Waltham, Massachusetts exists in this current form, beginning with this mill and then the Waltham Clock Company, Watch, thank you. Waltham is an industrial town near Boston that owes its current shape and form to being a center of American industry. So that's inescapable as I stand here. However, do machines make all of history like a strong technological determinist would say? No, that's equally preposterous. Machines cannot make all of history. We're seeing history in the making today in the year 2020 with COVID-19, with the social unrest due to civilian-police interactions. These are not due to, they're influenced perhaps by technologies, but the year 2020 has been shaped less by technology than by social, political, and cultural drivers. Granted, we would not be as aware of police-civilian interactions without, again, I'm going to pull this out of my pocket, without this being able to record those interactions, but those interactions would still take place in the absence of this device. So I think 2020 is a great rejoinder to anyone who would say that the only thing that shapes human history is technological innovation or progress. There are a lot of other reasons why society changes, and we're seeing a lot of those reasons this year. So in my mind, as a historian of technology, the real question is not do machines make history or all of history, but how exactly does technology make history? What's that relationship between technological innovation and social structure and human behavior? And that's a very complicated question, and that's what gives the field of the history of technology its vitality. It's a question that will never be answered because history always changes, technology always changes. So one of the challenges for historians of technology, we understand in general outline how technology shapes society. What we less understand is how technology shapes individual behavior and expectations. And again, I will pull myself, I should just leave my cell phone out. Many of you have probably been in a public place when someone took a phone call and had a very loud phone conversation on a bus or mass transit or on the street corner, and you're like, that's rude, why would someone do that? Especially if you're middle-aged or older. However, what's considered rude or socially unacceptable behavior has changed because of this device. A lot of people no longer think that it's rude to carry on a loud animated conversation over their phones in public. So that's one way in which human psychology, human behavior, and expectations have changed around a particular device. And I think it's important to pay attention to those internal changes as well as the more visible social changes. The fourth point I want to make is that human choice is important, but so is social structure. Karl Marx famously remarked that people make history but not under conditions of their own choosing. In a slightly different way, the British sociologist Anthony Giddens came up with a theory that he called structuration, which basically says the same thing, just with a lot more jargon, that people's choices and behaviors shape society, but those choices and behaviors are in turn structured by social structures that already exist. So we're embedded in social relations and structures, and that constrains our actions, but we can also change those social structures by the way that we behave. So it's a two-way street, a dialectic, if you will. Finally, I think that, and this is why I'm so interested in the history of technology, that modernity, that is what we call modern life, again, thinking of the roughly 200 years between this mill being built in 1813 and the year 2020 in which we're living. What exactly is modern life? And I think the modern life is no more and no less this really rich interplay between the development of technology and the development of society and how those two mutually shape each other. And this is a relationship, a mutual shaping, as I alluded to in my introduction, that really would have been hard to imagine in the world of 1513 or 1613 or 1713 or even 1813 for that matter. But it is easy and inescapable really to imagine this relationship between technology and society today. We're enmeshed in that, and modernity really, in my opinion, is this interplay between technology and society in ways that would have been impossible to our great-great-grandparents' ways of living. And I will stop here and be happy to answer any questions.
Well, you have a few. concluding questions. One, regarding social change, do your work and presentations go into mass manufacturing and labor issues? These are, of course, a major part of the history of technology.
I'm not clear how to address that question, except
Karen, who asked it, said she's asking in sort of general terms, not necessarily to cover them in detail tonight.
So again, thinking about the structure that I'm standing in today, industry requires a lot of people working under the same roof, using usually machines. It wouldn't make sense before industrial automation, even early 19th century industrial automation, to take a bunch of people and stick them in a building all doing the same thing by hand. Textile, for example, textile production was generally done before automation, before the water-powered mill, where textile companies in England it was called outwork, where you would, if you owned a textile company, you would hand off work at the beginning of the day to a family, and they would bring back finished products at the end of the day. So you didn't need a factory with hundreds or thousands of workers before technology changed, power technology and manufacturing technology changed how that work is done. And this threatens to spill into a discussion of how Karl Marx was a keen observer of capitalism. I'm going to gallop on past his comments on socialism and communism. But Karl Marx is a very keen observer of capitalism and the way that capitalism and technology interacted. And I think that's the real way to address that is, Marx remarked famously that the hand mill gives you feudalism, the steam mill gives you the industrial capitalist. And I think that represents this tension between labor and ownership, labor and capital in the 19th and 20th centuries, that whenever you amass a large workforce to use equipment that that workforce does not control or own, you're going to wind up with disputes and disagreements between laborers and owners of the equipment. It's inevitable. Well, I shouldn't say inevitable. I've spent the last hour telling you not to say inevitable. But it sort of is overdetermined that you're going to have conflict between the workers who don't own the means of production and the owners who own the means of production but choose not to do the work themselves. Does that, I feel like I'm not directly answering, but I'm not sure how else to grab onto that question.
I think you gave a rich response that may or may not have hit the target, but that was a noble and informative try. Mark asks, how does your analysis of technological innovation relate to the advances in the space program?
That's an excellent idea. This is just like with some of the examples we've talked about. The space program is an example of government-directed innovation. There's no economic or social necessity for the Apollo program. I'm a big fan of the space program. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. I kind of still do, but I'm too old. And we don't really have that opportunity as much anymore.
We all want to go, don't we? I mean, we all want to experience it and see it.
Right. But the space program is a really good example of government-driven technological goals. There's no economic reason. Matter of fact, it costs the country enormous amounts of money to send 12 men to the moon for a few days each. The real reason we embarked on the space program was the Cold War. If the Cold War hadn't happened, a lot of the rationale for doing it would have disappeared. We wanted to show the world that in our competition with the Soviets, that our technology was superior to theirs, and that we could create this space program that would land men on the moon and return them safely by the year 1970, as President Kennedy famously laid out in his speech at Rice University in 1962, which is Google. It's on Google. I encourage you to watch it. This is all driven by Cold War priorities. The idea was to showcase American technological prowess with respect to the Soviet Union. Had that Cold War competition never happened, it's arguable that going to space would have been would have happened in the way that it did.
We have a question from Christina that brings us to the present day. what do you believe is the future of Zoom in regards to society?
I can't make an intelligent forecast living in the midst of the events that I'm trying to forecast. If you asked me a year ago whether I would be teaching my courses through, I didn't even know Zoom existed a year ago, for that matter, or 6 months ago. I think I'd heard of it, but I'm like, you know, whatever. Unanticipated consequences. History is a way of taking turns that we don't expect. I don't know. I think more and more people would get used to teleconferencing and doing things remotely. I could also envision a future where people are tired of virtual interaction, and once the COVID crisis is resolved and we're able to go back to work, people will not want to use Zoom and will welcome the opportunity for human interaction, face-to-face human interaction. Let me also say that unanticipated consequences, think about 1989. In January 1989, if you went to a foreign policy expert, you know, Sovietologist as the phrasing went, and you said, give me your opinion on the likelihood of the Berlin Wall coming down by the end of this year and of the dictator of Romania being put to death by his own citizens. That specialist would have said, that's ridiculous, it'll never happen. The Berlin Wall is here to stay. In November of that year, the Berlin Wall came down. Things that were once unthinkable have a way of becoming thinkable. And we don't know what kind of moment we're living in until we've lived through that moment and have enough perspective on that moment to understand what it is we've experienced.
Professor Hochfelder, we have reached the end of our question stream, and maybe the end of your time with us tonight. Thank you very, very much for making the trip out here from Albany.
My pleasure.
And for sharing your knowledge and insights with our audience.